Hey guys, and welcome to week number 2. What I want to do today is basically just highlight um, some of the important information that I think you're going to need for this first writing assignment. It's a short paper that you have due this week, um, and it's sort of a general concept that you have to deal with. So I want to just make sure you touch on some of the key parts that I think that are going to be critical for this assignment. So hopefully I'll be able to do this in one short video. If not, there'll be another second version of this video. And basically what this first essay has you looking at is describing the various characteristics of America's developing criminal justice system in the colonial period. And so specifically, we're going to be looking at that in the context of police, courts, and corrections. Okay, because each of these concepts are discussed in some format or another in chapter 3, and then we go into chapter 4. And so that's just what this short lecture is going to be over. And then obviously if you have any questions about the paper itself as you begin to research it during the week, you can feel free to let me know. Okay. So I'm going to disappear so we can go ahead and talk about this week's topic, all right? Okay, so one of the things that we're going to be looking at, obviously, in terms of the colonial period is the colonies needed to develop early rules in terms of expectations for people's behavior, and then how those expectations are going to be enforced, and then how violations of those expectations was going to be handled. Keep in mind, if you go back to your early history, that each of the colonies was sort of unique and separate. And so each one had their own ways of dealing with different violations of community standards. And we'll talk about some of those here in just a little bit. Okay. So evolutionary changes that took place were geographical areas of early colonies that were often based on religion. And we'll talk about that in a second. And you'll begin hopefully to understand the impact that religion had on our early criminal justice system. The issue of slavery played a significant role in the creation of certain components of our criminal justice system that you may not be aware of. And so we're going to learn about the impact that slavery had on the criminal justice system. And then we'll be also looking at how to resolve legal issues once the community became more diverse and complex. In other words, as American society began to change, in other words, we became less homogeneous and more heterogeneous. How did society change in the sense of its enforcement of rules, the criminal justice system? All right, because as societies become more diverse, as we become more different from each other, then there's going to be a need to have more man-made rules versus God-made rules, because we all aren't agreeing on the same general philosophy or religious beliefs in terms of how man should or should not behave. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a couple things: demographics, geographical areas, how they impacted, the issue of religion, the issue of slavery, and then demographics, how we've changed, and as we change, how laws change, and how government gets more involved, and so the need to have a more robust criminal justice system. All right, so we're going to talk about the 3 specific colonies. We're going to talk about Virginia and the southern colonies. We'll talk about Massachusetts and the New England colonies, and then we'll be talking about Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic colonies. So when we look at the Virginia colonies, for example, it's important to understand the basis for some of that. And specifically, when you begin to understand that colonies were basically created or incorporated for different reasons. The Virginia colonies was primarily based off an economic ambition. In other words, it was going to be developed as a significant trading post for the English crown. And so the primary focus was on economics, planting, growing, harvesting, businesses, make it robust, all right? And the Virginia colonies were rather heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. Many of the members of that Virginia colony came there as either slaves, in which they agreed to come over there for passage and work for somebody for a specific number of years as an indentured servant, and then ultimately after those years passed, then they would be able to procure land and receive some monies. So some of those people that came over doing that. So obviously it was more single men than families coming over. Some of the people coming over were obviously sent over there as a form of punishment. So earlier you guys read last week about banishment, and people were excluded from cultures, societies as a means of punishment. In other words, they were kicked out and forced to live on their own. Well, at some point in time, those same people were transferred to places such as Australia and the United States to serve. And so they, in essence, became sort of free labor for many of the farmers at the time. And so that began to have a significant impact on things. And I'm just going to move my screen here just a little bit. Okay. Also, in terms of this particular location, Virginia colonies, because there are a lot of single men around, different laws were created, and some of those laws were called blue laws because of the piece of paper that they were written on. And these laws were designed to control drunkenness, gambling, and idleness. And so it's important now to understand that these laws obviously were focusing on men not doing anything, not working, gambling, and drinking. And so a lot of these laws were directed specifically at that type of behavior, which was found to be obviously inappropriate. The Virginia slave codes were also established at about that time, and these codes were basically slave laws. And these laws initially applied to both white and black slaves because both existed at the same time. And it did form a basis for an effort to try to deal with slaves in a more humane manner in terms of punishment. And so the slave codes ultimately left us with the idea of the need to have courts to deal with these type of violations. And as such, because Virginia was rather rural at the time, you'll see that it led to the creation of more local courts rather than more centralized courts in big urban areas, because slave owners didn't want to have to deal with the whole idea of transporting slaves rather far distances in order to have cases heard. So it is important that we understand the impact that the slave codes had, specifically the Virginia slave codes. So as you're reading through the chapter, understand the blue laws and the Virginia slave codes and their impact that it had on early American criminal justice systems. Now, English laws had some influence, and primarily that was English procedures and the law. So concepts such as indictment, arrest, and bail were all incorporated from the English. Unique was the idea of county courts and general courts, which again goes back to this concept of slave codes, and we'll talk a little bit more about these type of courts here in a little bit. But due to the influence of slavery and a dispersed population, courts need to be better coordinated with their services, and then again, courts need to be better located. So that was one of the influences that the British offered, or the English offered us as a means for early courts. Now, punishment and crime, specifically dealing with Virginia colonies, the use of corporal punishment and hangings, Dale's Law. Now, Dale's Law is parallel or parallels the philosophy, the Draco Code of ancient Athens. And as you recall, under Draco's law, capital punishment was mandated for almost 24 offenses, including repeated blasphemy, unlicensed trading with Indian tribes, stealing boats, unlicensed killings of cattle, and so forth. So Draco's laws had a very rather influential part in this whole idea of Dale's laws in terms of the type of punishment that was going to be meted out. So you can see that although it was very similar to Draco's laws, it was more attuned to what the issues were at the colonies, and specifically that was, for example, trading with Indians, stealing boats, those type of things. And so they had a significant impact on early Virginia law and our criminal justice system and how we went about dealing with law violators. Now, the benefit of clergy was often used by the English, and basically in our discussion of benefit of clergy, the book talks about that while the poor and the illiterate went to gallows for their crimes, their landed and more diligent neighbors could plead benefit of clergy by reciting the age-old neck verse from the Bible to get off with a stiff reprimand and a brand on the thumb. So in other words, the more educated one was, the more one could benefit from this benefit of clergy. And your ability to read and recite a verse is what kept you from going to the gallows. All right. So understand that primarily corporal punishment and hanging was the primary method of resolving criminal misconducts at the time period, and specifically because the colonies weren't equipped quite yet to deal with the concepts of jail as we know them today, and obviously prisons. Okay, so let's take a look at Massachusetts and the English colonies, in the New England colonies. And specifically, these colonies were established on the idea of religious idealism. So the Puritans and the Pilgrims created their colonies for religious purposes. Created own laws related to the colonial needs. Puritans had the highest percentage of family units, a very homogeneous society. So the Puritans, unlike those of the Virginia colonies, tended to be more family-oriented. They had, again, the highest percentage of family units. So as such, their society is more homogeneous. So in terms of dealing with transgressions, you will find that it was a little bit different. It's much easier to deal with lawbreakers in a society that is homogeneous versus that is heterogeneous. Because in a homogeneous type society, for example, shaming or some other type of non-physical punishment had a significant impact. In other words, the whole fact that you embarrassed yourself and your family, and then the whole idea punishment at that time under these type of colonies, Massachusetts, the Puritans and the Pilgrims and so forth, was that the purpose was that they wanted the offender to come back into the fold. In other words, confess one's sins, but the realization that that would not happen anymore and return to the fold. And that was able to control human behavior. And obviously today, with our very heterogeneous society, such actions would not be probably very successful in curbing one's behavior. In terms of lawgivers, you could take a look at this. The book talks about assistant courts, general courts, and the biblical influence on the criminal justice system. And it looks like I'm going to be leaving you here for just a second, and we'll come back for part 2.